Yes, tonight we have our own ministry fellow from the Harvard College Faith in Action, Nick Nowalk, to speak tonight about God Says Sex is Good. It's going to be really good. I know he's seminary trained and he's full of wisdom and knowledge. So if you guys could give him a round of applause as he comes up, that
would be awesome. Hey, good evening. It's great to be here with you. And let me do this right at the very beginning. I'm going to give out my email if you want to either follow up with me and get the lecture manuscript for your own study and reflection afterwards. Also, because in 45 minutes there's probably more in my notes than I can cover, so there'll be some things that I won't be able to say. And also, if anyone wants to continue the conversation one-on-one with me through email, through meeting together in person, I'd be happy to do that. So my email is really easy to remember. It's just nick.nowalk@gmail.com. N-O-W-A-L-K, just like a street sign. So God says that sex is good. Let me start with this. One thing that I think is irrefutable historically is that the deep connections between sex and religion have been intuitive to most societies since the dawn of history. And all the way from ancient times right down to today, God and human sexuality have each regularly been approached and interpreted in light of the other. This is not a normative statement of approval, it's just a descriptive statement of fact. That human beings, over and over throughout history, have seen and felt and had an instinct that sex and religion somehow are bound up with each other. The question is, why that is. What is it about sex and about worship, about human sexuality, and about God that constantly draw human beings to connect the two? Let me give a few examples, both from the ancient world and from our modern society, to show how human beings regularly see and intuit a connection between sex and religion. In the Old Testament, Israel regularly compares her relationship to God as that of a bride and a bridegroom. That the image that Israel uses of how they relate to God and how God relates to them is the way a husband and a wife relate to each other. That theme is dominant throughout the Old Testament. And even outside of Israel, in the ancient Near East, there are regular hints in the Old Testament and in ancient documents that we have that there were fertility cults that connected sex and worship on a regular basis. One of the more memorable ones, although it's not too well known, many of you probably know that the ancient world is filled with creation stories. Probably every culture in the ancient world had one. Some of the more famous ones like Enuma Elish and Gilgamesh and Atrahasis are out there, and of course there's the one in Genesis. But there's a lesser known one that comes from the ancient world, that comes from the Egyptian society. And in it, there's this god, Atum, who wants to create but can't on his own. And here's how the text describes that Atum creates. It says this, and this is pretty graphic. I didn't make this up, I'm just reading it. Atum evolved growing a phallus. So he develops a sexual organ. And then it says, and he put his penis in his grasp, that he might make an orgasm with it, and the two siblings were born, Shu and Tefnut, and then through those two gods, he creates the world. Now, scholars don't know a lot about this creation story, but the only thing we can conclude reliably about it is that apparently a group of teenage boys wrote it. Because there's really no other explanation for connecting creation and masturbation, but that's what the text does. And so, sex and religion are constantly being connected in graphic ways and explicit ways in the ancient world. And of course, when you come to the New Testament is filled with sexual imagery and symbolism to describe the significance and the identity of Jesus and his relationship to his people. In Ephesus, Paul runs into a Greek religious group that has temple prostitutes, that the prostitutes, as an act of worship, offer up their bodies to men who want to have sex with them in their holy temple. And again, that's not a rare thing in the ancient world. But even down to today, people still make the connection between sex and religion. I could multiply these examples endlessly. I'll just mention a few. Graham Greene, the British novelist, in his book, The End of the Affair, which from beginning to end is all about exploring the connections between faith and sex, has one of his characters say this: "The words of human love have long been used by the saints to describe their vision of God, and so, I suppose, we might also use the terms of prayer, meditation, contemplation to explain the intensity of the love a man and a woman feel for each other. But Green is pointing out that just as you can use love and sexual language to describe God, so you can use religious language to describe sex. Ian McEwan, in his novel Atonement, which probably many of you have read, I think this example is all the more remarkable because some of you might know McEwan is a very outspoken atheist. And yet, early on in the story, before all the tragedy later on happens, Robbie and Cecilia, when they have their first sexual encounter, McEwan says this about Robbie. Robbie had no religious belief to speak of, and yet it was impossible for him in this act of sex not to think of an invisible presence or witness in the room with them, and that these words spoken aloud of love and devotion were like signatures on an unseen contract. That even for McEwan as an atheist, there's something religious, mystical about sex. So the question is, what exactly is it about sex and about God and about religious faith that seem to compel us to connect the dots between them? And I think a lot of answers can be given, a lot of answers are given, but in my mind, I think there's two features that sex and religion have in common with each other that make a pretty obvious connection between them palatable. Both sex and religion, in their different ways, I think represent the pinnacle of human experience, both in terms of intimacy and in terms of ecstasy. Both in terms of the vulnerability of knowing and being known by another and self-giving love in a relationship, both sex on the human plane and worship on the divine plane seem to be the pinnacle of the human experience of intimacy with someone that is not you, someone that is other. And on the other hand, in terms of ecstasy, joy, pleasure, fulfillment, happiness, very few things stand out in human history for being pursued for those things than religion and sex. And so I think in terms of the transcendence kind of taking us out of ourselves, leading us to fulfillment and deeper meaning and significance, sex and religion are constantly and easily connected with each other. Of course, today, there are increasing calls for the disconnection between these two things and the insistence, often a very loud insistence, that to connect sex and religion poisons sex. It makes it narrow-minded, it leads human beings to repress their own sexual desires and experiences. And of course, many examples could be given here, but one example I'll give is Katy Perry, who, this actually came out before she got divorced recently, but Katy Perry, many of you might know, grew up in a very kind of restrictive fundamentalist Christian home, and often when she speaks about it in interviews, there's a lot of bitterness about it. And when she was first married, she said this in an interview with Rolling Stone: "I think that when you put sex and spirituality in the same bottle and shake it up, bad things happen." And I think that's a dominant impression that many people have today, that this connection humanity has often seen between sex and religion is an unfortunate one and one that we should outgrow and get rid of. So, toward that end, I want to look at, over the next few minutes, 4 aspects of the Christian story of sex. What it is that Christians believe about sex, but even more, why they believe what they have historically believed about sex. And I'll give a short overview here, and then we'll spend our time looking one by one at these 4 aspects.